been a good deal of confusion about what happened when Chamberlain came back from Munich, and in particular in relation to the Peace in Our Time statement. When he got to the Hessen airport, as it was then, he waved about a bit of paper and gave it a lot of publicity. When he got back to the dining seat, there was, of course, the most enormous crowd inside and outside the house. And I was about, I suppose, 6 paces behind him on the staircase as he went up in number 10. And somebody, I couldn't identify the voice, but somebody said to him, Neville, go up to the historic window and and repeat the statement of peace in our time. And he turned rather angrily on whoever it was, and he said, no, I don't do that kind of thing.
I have been talking with the German Chancellor, Herr Hitler, and I have in my hand a piece of paper bearing both our names, expressing our desire
Thank you,
for peace
Neville,
in our time.
Neville, we've cut.
Oh, well, was that all right?
Very, very good.
Good.
I love the firmness in your voice. It was absolutely terrific.
Oh, good.
I just wondered, when you say, I have a piece of paper, I have in my hand a piece of paper, you could actually have a piece of paper in your hand.
Oh.
It was sort of hammer the point across.
Ah, I see.
So could we try it just once more with a piece of paper in your hand?
Yes. Oh, Eric.
What?
We've lost it.
You've lost what?
Well, we can't find the bit that he signed.
I see. It doesn't matter. If you've got a piece of paper for Neville, please, that'll do.
Yes,
That's
Anthony
all
thought
right.
Alec had it, you know, and
Neville-
Alec said that... Yes,
Yes,
I see. Yes.
Neville.
Just do it again.
Do it again, yes.
Somewhere between the middle of the staircase and the last 10 feet or so, somebody must have said to him, oh, Neville, go and do it. And of course he did, and that was a great mistake, and he knew it from the moment he had done it, because it was an unjustifiable claim. So that is how that happened. But the true Chamberlain was the one halfway up the staircase, and the false Chamberlain, so to speak, was the one who appeared at the window and made the statement of peace in our time.
is honor? A word. What is that word honor? Air. This is a tale of intrigue, ambition, power, betrayal, and a story of false myths. The theme is one of honor, those who had it, and those who lost it. London, the capital of a mighty empire, with Parliament in the land where speech is as free as thought, where the language of Shakespeare defends the ideas of democracy, and where, in 1938, peace was running wild all over the place. From the Speaker's chair in the Commons to Speaker's corner in Hyde Park, many men went on a lot about peace and their ideas of democracy, but they did not believe in them enough to think they were worth fighting for. And today, the words still come cheap.
England is a great country. England has always been a great country. England as a nation can never be defeated.
Does anybody here know why 6 million Jews died in the Holocaust? Anybody have a clue? Why are there wars?
Materialism.
Why?
Greed and materialism.
How many Americans here? Put your hands up. You Americans are the biggest bullshitters in the world. You Americans went to the moon. We could have told you there was nothing up there, and you still went up there. We have never forgiven you Americans in 1942 when we saved you from 2 great wars. And all you could give us was chewing gum, stockings and chocolate. My mother is still shitting with that chocolate you eat.
When Chamberlain got that piece of paper from Hitler, and Chamberlain came back to England and said that there's going to be peace in our time, the Germans believed that we were not prepared to go to war.
I'll tell you what, I was born in 1941. I was a war baby in the East End of London. The houses were raised 3 sides of us. And I'd like now to do you an impression of a twin-prop aeroplane, because it's a very deep memory of mine. It goes like this. You know there's the engine sound of 1 engine, but I have to make the sound of 2 engines with 1 mouth. And I'm going to do that now. Here we go. Twin-engine jet plane, because I was a war baby, you see.
Well, as an Englishman, of course I can. The word Germany comes from the words many germs. There are some nice people in Czechoslovakia. I can't say that about Germany or France or Italy or any of these other European countries. I can't even say it about Russia. But Czech people, they're all right. There's not many of them, and that's what makes them all right. You see, let us understand. I don't care who you are. I don't care where you come from. What I am saying is this, that England as a nation, we know we're the best.
Bismarck said of Bohemia that it was the key to the control of Europe. But Prague is far from London, and Bismarck's words meant nothing to the British foreign secretaries, who felt able to say that wars in such outlandish places were of no concern to the British Empire. The land of Czechoslovakia was a faraway country in which the British never had any interest. Lovers may have heard of Smetana, Borchardt, and Janacek, historians of Jan Hus, King Charles, the Battle of the White Mountain, and the Tale of the Winter Queen. Some Englishmen, like H.G. Wells, had even heard of Karel Čapek and his idea of the modern robot. But for some Britons, Bohemia was just a place in a Christmas song about King Wenceslas. It was a word, like honor is a word. At the Versailles Peace Conference in 1918-1919, Tomáš Masaryk secured the word of the victorious Allied powers to realize his dream of creating an independent Czechoslovakia. In his inaugural presidential speech, he said, "Our whole history inclines us towards the democratic powers. Our Renaissance is a logical link between us and the democracies of the West." 10 years on, the Czechs celebrated his achievement, not knowing that they had only 10 more years in which to enjoy it. Masaryk's nation was composed of many different races, but his dream was that they should live in the freedom of democracy. Created by visions and words, living by the freedom to speak and think aloud, Czechoslovakia was protected by alliances, words on paper. Beneš, who succeeded Masaryk in 1935, pledged his word to defend the young nation. But within 2 years of the death of its founder, the nation which had lived by words died by them. Beneš, like Masaryk, used a spider's web of alliances to cocoon Czechoslovakia from potential enemies. Chief amongst these allies was France, whose military assistance was pledged. The French, like Bismarck, thought that to be the master of Hradčany Castle in Prague was the key to Central Europe. But the British documents at the Public Record Office at Kew, though they contain many words, include no treaty guaranteeing Czechoslovakia. Although there was no treaty or any obligation on the part of Britain, Chamberlain had decided to interfere in the affairs of the sovereign state of Czechoslovakia, a country he knew nothing about. In the Prime Minister's file, Prem 1/266A, documents on the Munich Conference of 1938 can be found, and in the Foreign Office file FO 371/21745, the minutes of what one clerk said to another lie beside memoranda which broke up a nation. Why so many British words on such a far-away country?
I was Mr. Chamberlain's parliamentary private secretary, which is really the lowest form of political life, and therefore had no real function. He invited me to go with him to Munich because he thought that on the return I could explain matters to the members of the House of Commons, because the parliamentary private secretary is a sort of liaison between the Prime Minister and the members of Parliament. So actually I had no function there, or official position there, and I sat outside in the adjoining room during the time of the discussion of the agreement with General Keitel and a number of others, and Goering came in, and we talked generally while the agreement was being reached. When it was signed, I actually went into the room to watch the signature. So, Chamberlain had some reasons, very strong reasons, for trying to get a genuine peace, if it could be negotiated. Now, the center of the argument, of course, was about Czechoslovakia, about the Sudetenland, and the self-determination for the Sudetenland, and that was part of the Munich agreement.
V Československu totiž nešlo vůbec tehdy o otázku na výhradně národnostní. Každý z nás, ať z Němců nebo z Čechů, měl nějakého německého nebo českého předka. Tady šlo o zásadní otázku, která tehdy tvořila hráz a přehradu v celé Evropě. To je otázku demokracie a fašismu.
The thing that's so maddening is to look back at the quality of the democracy that Czechoslovakia represented at the time of the Munich Agreement. Here was a country that had really been a home and a refuge for refugees from Austria, from other parts of Europe, who were escaping the Nazis, coming to Czechoslovakia precisely because they knew the kind of democracy that was there, that they could exercise their freedoms. And yet, once they got there, instead of the United States and Great Britain supporting this one democracy that they really should have supported above all other countries in Central Europe at that time, they had to escape yet once again as the Nazis rolled over them.
Bismarck said that blood and iron were stronger than words. The words of Hitler in his Bible, Mein Kampf, were to much the same effect. Yet it was through the power of the spoken word that Hitler encompassed the means to employ blood and iron until he was truly the godfather of Europe. As such, he could export the salient features of his regime, persecuting Jews, burning books, and preparing for war. It was little wonder that the small democratic republic of Czechoslovakia should have felt nervous of such a neighbor.
Diese Erscheinung aus dem deutschen Leben beseitigt sein würde. Hitler! Hitler aber ist Deutschland, wie Deutschland Hitler ist! Hitler! Sieg! Sieg!
Racial purity demanded that all Germans join the Reich. If there was something rotten in the state of Czechoslovakia, it was to be found in the northwestern border regions, the so-called Sudetenland. There a gymnastics instructor, Konrad Henlein, performed the exercises set out for him by the Godfather and demanded autonomy for Germans within Czechoslovakia. The Sudeten Germans had never belonged to Germany, but Chamberlain, being ignorant of this fact, continually referred to the Sudeteners as being returned to Germany. This attitude of the Prime Minister played into the hands of both Hitler and Henlein. Within months, they increased their demands and started to scream for the cessation of Sudetenland to the Nazi Reich, the separation which Chamberlain favored.
The question of the German minority in Czechoslovakia on what to do about it, about German complaints, how to resolve that naturally was strictly an internal affair of Czechoslovakia. Unfortunately, it became, of course, a problem when Hitler raised the issue. Then it became sort of an international question.
The flirtation of Chamberlain's government started long before Hitler started to make claims on Czechoslovakia. In 1937, Field Marshal Goering, a Nazi chieftain, invited a senior cabinet minister, Lord Halifax, to an international hunting exhibition in Germany. Who was the hunter and who the hunted? The object for Halifax was to stress and tell Hitler that Britain would not use force to prevent him from accomplishing his goals in Eastern Europe, and that the British were honestly out to make friends with the Nazis. But as the politicians came and went, the British cameras preferred to show the black cat of Downing Street. Definitely it was helping the public image of Number 10. What a kind household. Neville Chamberlain's foreign policy was to accommodate the dictators like Hitler and Mussolini. By overstepping his power as the Prime Minister and arranging deals behind Anthony Eden's back, he had progressively undercut Eden's authority. Eden, as the Foreign Secretary, disagreed with Chamberlain's policies and resigned in February 1938 because he was not prepared to agree to any concessions made to the Italians. Chamberlain could now open talks with Mussolini, who could help him fix Anglo-German relations. Clement Attlee, the Labour leader, was less pleased.
It will be said that this country has surrendered to the demands of a dictator. They are not prepared to stand for the League of Nations. They are not prepared to stand for democracy. They are prepared to make any kind of deal with the dictatorship powers. There will be no longer in this country a government which is prepared to stand up for international law and right, but a government that is prepared to enter into any kind of a deal with aggressive fascist powers. This policy is not a policy that will lead to peace. It will not lead to a settlement of the affairs of Europe. It is essentially a war policy, and it aligns this country with the reactionary forces of the world. The repercussions of this event will be widespread in the dominions, in the colonies, and throughout the world. It is most noticeable that everywhere the enemies of peace and democracy are rejoicing, the friends of this country are depressed.
On the 12th of March 1938, Hitler's armies strolled into the land of his birth, Austria, and proclaimed the Anschluss, or Union of the German-speaking peoples, abolishing the old frontiers. The camera recorded that the whole thing was completed without bloodshed and had showed only the rapturous joy and cheers. Yet, within hours, the prosecution of Jews, Democrats, and anti-Nazi opposition started. Surrounded on three sides by Nazi Germany, Czechoslovakia seemed likely to be the next item on the Godfather's shopping list. During a meeting between the French Premier, Daladier, his Foreign Minister, Bonnet, and the British, Chamberlain informed the French that Czechoslovakia could not be defended. That was the first step to undermine the Czech-French treaty. The public was told something else.
And we believe that useful results have been achieved by our visit to London.
A few days later, the Godfather sent his gymnastics instructor to Britain to pull the wool over the eyes of the British politicians.
Britain and France demonstrate the solidarity of the Anglo-French axis.
On the 20th of March 1938, Chamberlain wrote to his sister, "Nothing that France or we could do could possibly save the Czechs from being overrun by Germans. I have therefore abandoned any idea of giving a guarantee to Czechoslovakia or to the French in connection with her obligations to that country." Once Chamberlain had decided to sacrifice Czechoslovakia, he had employed all means of persuasion to break French military guarantees to the Czechs. So it was that the British and French performed an uneasy diplomatic quadrille.
Well, in the first place, America has imported the Lambeth Walk. London has sent a dance to New York.
The rest of the world, unaware of the diplomatic machinations, preferred singing, dancing, and enjoying themselves if they could afford it.
It's not altogether the Lambeth Walk as I know it, and I've been in some crushes this summer, but the girls, being as quick on the uptake as they are easy to look at, Lupino Lane won't mind. Even the onlookers begin to catch on. And so me and my girls step out in New York doing the Lambeth Walk.
The Nazis preferred the dance rhythm of the goose step. The Americans could enjoy prettier parades, caring even less about what was going on in Europe.
I think the United States played two unfortunate roles in the whole crisis brought about by Munich. First, because Roosevelt couldn't be as strong-minded in arguing with England standing against Hitler, because he knew how divided the American people were, he allowed a lot of ambiguity in his policy to stand. And as a result, it was possible for Chamberlain to listen to Joe Kennedy, who had a very different point of view from President Roosevelt, and assume that Joe Kennedy was really speaking for America in backing him 100% on appeasing Hitler and allowing Munich to go forward.
Joe Kennedy, the successful businessman and film producer, was prepared to hum along to the strains of Chamberlain's deals as the new American ambassador and made it clear what his policy was.
I think it's important to remember that Kennedy was appointed ambassador to the Court of St. James because he had been a successful businessman. He had contributed to Roosevelt's campaign in 1932, and then Roosevelt appointed him the head of the Securities and Exchange Commission after the stock market crash. He did a surprisingly good job there, and then the next leap was made to appoint him ambassador to the Court of St. James. Unfortunately, he brought with him to that position this narrow businessman's outlook, which had been incredibly successful in America and in the business world, but was the last thing we needed on the brink of World War II. We needed somebody in that position who could have a breadth of vision and understand what we were up against with Hitler, something that history had never really quite seen before. It was that historical understanding and that vision that he didn't really have. Indeed, even when he got to Europe and he became ambassador, he allied himself with Chamberlain because they shared that businessman's outlook. And even after Munich, and even after the failure of Munich, and even after Czechoslovakia was occupied by Hitler in March of 1939, even then Kennedy was still meeting with various businessmen, heads of corporations worldwide, with the German finance minister in hopes that they could still bring about peace with Hitler somehow, so as not to disrupt these normal business relationships. That was the sad thing. Roosevelt made a terrible decision to appoint this man because we needed somebody just the opposite during that time.
Nobody really realized how close everything was. And in 1938 already, I felt we were so near war. And in 1939, of course, it happened. I do feel that during that time, there were many people, like Eden, who did realize the danger. But nobody seemed to be able to really shake the apathy of the majority of people. But the people didn't even begin to realize how the Chamberlain government was no match for these gangsters. And when eventually in 1938 I was here during the summer, Chamberlain came and I stood outside the Regina Hotel where his delegation stayed and saw him arrive, and I saw him leaving, telling us all that this was peace in our time. To me, it was absolute madness to give in on anything, this regime. And when I went back to England and propounded these ideas, many people felt that this was no menace for us. It was probably a bulwark against communism.
Neville Chamberlain became Prime Minister in May 1937. A lonely and austere man in public, he had a fundamental contempt for those who were born outside the Anglo-Saxon race, particularly those of Jewish origin, and an absolute faith in the moral rectitude of the British Empire. From the start, he wanted a deal which would allow him to share power globally and to preserve that empire.
With this country, where we said goodbye to increased taxation and further cuts, and on the contrary are able to begin the work of relief.
Consolidating the British economy after the 1931 crash and dreaming about Teutonic unity like his father Joe, Chamberlain did not want to see all his hopes dashed by standing against Hitler. A deal with the dictators would have to be made.
Chamberlain regarded his accord with Hitler as being the fulfillment of his father's most cherished dream. Joseph Chamberlain, Neville's father, had tried for many years to achieve an alliance between Britain and Germany. And so when Neville Chamberlain signed an agreement at Munich, he very much saw it as the fulfillment of all of his father's fondest wishes in the area of European diplomacy. As Neville Chamberlain understood it, appeasement was not the diplomacy of capitulation, but a powerful and dramatic policy by which all of the outstanding problems of European diplomacy were to be settled in one dramatic and final agreement.
Both Joe Kennedy and Neville Chamberlain were like brothers when it came to their attitudes toward appeasement. They both came out of World War I with a real hatred toward war in general that I think was legitimate and genuine in both men. They also both had this business background. Chamberlain's a failed background, Joe Kennedy's splendidly successful, but it made them equate civilization with the economic structure of the world, and they had this ridiculous fear that war would end civilization as they knew it because it would disrupt the markets from one country to another. And they both came out of that business background, I think, also believing that a rational deal was possible with anyone as long as you could bargain, even including Hitler. And those things tied together two very different men who should have been on different sides of the issues just by temperament. Chamberlain, tall, stiff, cold, Kennedy, the opposite, this gregarious, open Irishman, but their attitudes toward war and their overbelief in business made them brothers as far as appeasement went.
Abyssinia, Spain, China. 3 wars, concessions to the dictators. Chamberlain's attitude to non-white territories was that they were only real estate to be traded as national interest dictated. The 1930s brought new refinements to the horror of war, with the fleshing of the maiden weapon of the bomber, as the cameras were quick to show. There was a plentiful supply of material for the eye of the camera. In Abyssinia, where Mussolini fixed the regime of Haile Selassie with bombs and gas, and in Spain, where the fixer's men could be found alongside German airmen perfecting the blitzkrieg and using Spanish fields as the training ground. On the wide screen, the camera showed what became of civilians in modern war, and the shivers down the spine did nothing to stiffen the backs of democratic governments who already feared that the bomber will always get through. The high-flying American aviator Charles Lindbergh, seeking refuge in Europe after the tragic kidnap of his son, helped this process by acting as a Nazi propaganda tool.
It's most unfortunate that Lindbergh, although he was a very skilled flyer himself, both in flying planes but in navigation, and had done many, many long flights to places that hadn't been flown to before, and was a first-class airman in that sense, was not a military airman. He had not, he had no particular range of knowledge about what could be expected of the Luftwaffe if war came in the fall of 1938. And without that knowledge, what he did was to kick up an absolute storm of fear, quite unnecessary fear. He told people that if war came, that within a matter of weeks, the Luftwaffe was so powerful that all the other air forces would have been destroyed, that bombs would be dropping all over England and cities would be blazing, which was absolute rot. Despite the quality of the Luftwaffe, which was much larger, to be sure, than the numbers of any other major nation, and did indeed have some very good air types. The fact was that it was not made for long-range heavy bombardment. They had virtually no 4-engine planes, but in terms of the attacking of England, which was the main thing that Chamberlain feared, there was no chance of it at that time, no reason to fear it. And Lindbergh completely misjudged the military air situation, and did that with the aid of these speeches and meetings, in which he put great fear into many politicians of high level of power, so that I think his influence on a considered judgment of the situation in 1938 was very poor.
A war today is fundamentally different from all the wars of the past, inasmuch as its first and its most numerous victims would not be the professional fighters, but the civilian population, the workmen, the clerk, the housewife, and most horrible of all, the children.
Gas masks at their sides, Mr. and Mrs. Chamberlain were aware what power these camera images projected to the people. As the government itself feared the bomber, it had no difficulty orchestrating this message to the general public, and created an atmosphere of fearful apathy. The new fashion in facial wear acted like a talisman against the evil one, but like all charms, it was a sign of fear, and a reminder of the dangers of the terror by night and the arrow that flieth by day. But nobody informed the public that as far as Britain was concerned, there was no way that the German Air Force could attack Britain effectively and drop their death charges. In 1938, the Luftwaffe did not have a plane which could reach the coast of England. On the 26th of July, Neville Chamberlain informed the House of Commons that he was sending Lord Runciman to Prague as a mediator in response to a request from the Czechoslovak government. That was a lie by Chamberlain, the dealer. He used the growing crisis in Sudetenland as a pretext and forced Runciman on the Czechs. It was made clear to Benesch that unless he accepted this forceful intrusion into his domestic affairs, he would be left to face dire consequences. Czechoslovakia must realize that, sovereign state though she was, there were times when, in the interests of Anglo-German relations, nothing should be put in the way.
When Runciman was sent to Czechoslovakia in August 1938, already Chamberlain was decided that he must bring a recommendation which will not endanger peace, that simply peace at all costs, even at the expense of Czechoslovakia. So I think that Runciman, from the very beginning, simply felt that he must bring back a recommendation which will be acceptable to Hitler, because without doing what Hitler wanted, there was a risk of war.
The whole mission was a hoax, which served only as a public gimmick in England and fooled the Czechs into believing that the British were their allies. The missionary strongly recommended that Czechoslovakia should give assurances to her neighbors that she would under no circumstances attack them or other states. But where Shakespeare's Winter Tale placed Bohemia in the Balkans, Runciman's Midsummer Night's Dream set fair to misplace the Czech border regions inside Germany. So the missionary had a good time with the gymnastic instructor. As the rumors of war cast shadows, people waited, and in rooms men came and went. Outside, Chamberlain presented a good image of a democratic leader. Once inside, he took command, and unknown to all but one member of the cabinet, the Prime Minister in complete secrecy formulated a scheme, Plan Z, without prior approval of king or cabinet, whereby he would go to meet Hitler and personally offer him a piece of Czechoslovakian land which never belonged to his kingdom. On the 14th of September, the cabinet learned that Plan Z had been put into effect.
In my opinion, Neville Chamberlain was one of the most powerful, if not the most powerful, prime minister in British history. This was particularly so with respect to his control over the apparatus of foreign policy making within the British government. In this respect, as if in no other, Chamberlain had absolute control over the foreign policy apparatus, and he used it with a vengeance. During the period in which he was Prime Minister, Chamberlain completely disregarded the traditional principle of collective responsibility, and during that period, foreign policy was his policy, and no one anywhere in the government was allowed to raise a dissenting voice.
The godfather was pleased and kindly allowed the dealer to come to his private residence in Berchtesgaden. The press hailed their dealer in peace as a great hero because at 69 he was taking his first flight.
I'm going to meet the German Chancellor because the situation seems to me to be one in which discussions between him and me may have useful consequences. My policy has always been to try to ensure peace, and the Führer's ready acceptance of my suggestion encourages me to hope that my visit to him will not be without result.
It was to be hoped that his diplomatic skills were greater than his sense of direction. Or was it a new downstep that he did before boarding the plane? Berchtesgaden, the Godfather's own private residence, dictator and prime minister would meet, talk, and descend from the mountain to divide and rule.
Die ganze Welt dachte damals, das würde in Europa und auch in der ganzen Welt Frieden bringen. Und zwar war die Treppe hier vorne etwa, ungefähr 19 Meter von hier entfernt. Da ist also Chamberlain hochgegangen und wurde oben von Hitler empfangen, anschließend in die große Halle geleitet, die hier über diesen Ruinen sich befand. Dort stellte Hitler seine sämtlichen Mitarbeiter vor und zog sich dann mit Chamberlain zurück hinauf in sein Arbeitszimmer, um dort in einem dreistündigen Gespräch über die augenblickliche Weltsituation zu sprechen und um eben den Frieden der Welt zu erhalten.
To the Godfather's surprise, Chamberlain asked what he would do if the Czechs could be made to give up the Sudetenland. The Prime Minister had gone alone to the Godfather's lair, not because he was naive, but because he already knew what he was going to do. The dealer had come prepared. He needed no diplomatic advisers of stature, for he had already decided that parts of Czechoslovakia would have to be conceded to Hitler. The questions were, which parts and how?
I've come back again, rather quicker than I expected. Yesterday afternoon, I had a long talk with Herr Hitler. It was a frank talk, but it was a friendly one. And I feel satisfied now that each of us fully understands what is in the mind of the other. And later on, perhaps in a few days, I'm going to have another talk with Herr Hitler. Only this time, he has told me that it is his intention to come halfway to meet me. He wishes to spare an old man another such a long journey.
He promised to return when the French and Czechs had agreed to his plan. Their next meeting would also be in Germany, not in London, where the Godfather was afraid to be received with demonstrations of disapproval.
And that there was no question of peace in Europe while Hitler continued to dominate it. And therefore, the only hope was to say no, and the sooner one said no, the easier it would be. The longer you delayed it, the stronger Hitler would get, the more terrified the other small countries of Europe would become and have to make the best deals they could with him, which wouldn't be very good deals from their point of view, but would be better than nothing. And in a very short time, we, this country and France, would find the whole of Europe, more or less, allied against us. And my father simply could not prevail upon Chamberlain to understand. Again and again he suggested various ideas that might at least give Hitler a hint that we were not going to sit by silently and allow him to take more and more. He suggested mobilizing the fleet, which in his position as First Lord of the Admiralty he was able to do. Chamberlain absolutely refused to allow him to do so. And eventually he realized that there was no means that Chamberlain, on his first visit to Hitler at Berchtesgaden, came back, gave the cabinet a complete account of the way the conversations had gone, and my father could hardly believe his ears, because Chamberlain appeared to be proud of what he had done. In fact, he had come back, he hadn't achieved a single concession from Hitler. He'd given concessions all the way along the line. I think what one has to remember about Chamberlain was that his horizons also actually were extremely narrow. He didn't know Europe at all. He practically never travelled abroad. When he did, it was on a quiet holiday with Mrs. Chamberlain. He had virtually no foreign friends at all. He spoke no foreign languages. And I honestly think that, I mean, a few months before the whole Czechoslovak crisis arose, I think he'd have been very hard put to have found the Sudetenland on the map.
After the consultation with the British cabinet and with France, and the sending of the terms of suggested settlement to the government of Czechoslovakia, Mr. Neville Chamberlain left Heston again for his second meeting with Herr Hitler.
European peace is what I am aiming at, and I hope that this journey may open the way to get it.
As Chamberlain's plane left for Godesberg, there had been boos at Heston Airport. A mass observation poll on the 22nd of September showed that only 22% of the British public supported Chamberlain's policy and 40% opposed it.
The proprietor of this hotel was a personal friend of the Führer. He knew him when he was a corporal in the army, and he supported Hitler at a time when he had very few supporters. Mr. Chamberlain's plane landed at Cologne Airport, and the Premier was greeted by Sir Neville Henderson, the British ambassador in Berlin, and by Herr von Ribbentrop, the German foreign minister. There were smiles and hiles on all sides for Britain's ambassador for peace, who inspected stormtroopers before leaving the airport.
Honour, it turned out, was a mere scutcheon. After Berchtesgaden, the British and French put pressure on the Czechs, who were forced to agree to cede parts of their country to the Godfather. Now the dealer was on the way to tell Hitler the good news.
Then the Premier left with an escort of fast cars and drove along the motor road to Godesberg, where the second series of talks would take place. A suite had been reserved for the Prime Minister at the Hotel Petersburg, high among the hills of the Rhine, on the opposite side of the river from the hotel where Hitler was waiting.
From his hotel room, Chamberlain could look out across the river to the Godfather's hotel room. The Hotel Dresden was a favourite haunt of top Nazis looking for relaxation. Chamberlain hoped his news would relax European tension and satisfy the Godfather. His colleagues had said no more concessions, but Chamberlain made them all the same. Perhaps he could have said, as Prince Hal did of Falstaff, "I am bewitched with the rogue's company. If the rascal hath not given me medicines to make me love him, I'll be hanged."
Als Mr. Chamberlain 1938 hier in Bad Godesberg war, wohnte er hier oben auf dem Hotel Petersberg. Um zur Konferenz zu kommen, musste er von dem Petersberg einer Autostraße herunterfahren in das Tal hinein und fuhr dann dieser heutige Bundesstraße 42 den Rhein entlang bis zu der Fähre Niederdollendorf. Diese Fähre, die war damals nicht wie heute.
After a short rest, Mr. Chamberlain went to the Hotel Dresden to resume discussions with the Führer. The world waited as they met again.
Ja, das ist hier also der sogenannte Amperraum, Ampersaal, wo die Begegnung stattfand mit Chamberlain. Ich kann mich noch genau entsinnen. Wir sind hier, waren drei runde Tische, wie gesagt von der Redoute aus, geliehen. Und ich weiß noch hier, saß Mr. Chamberlain, Adolf Hitler, und ich habe dann den Tee serviert.
Well, Hitler arrived in the hotel on the 22nd of September at about 12 o'clock. He went upstairs to his old room, had a meal, and at about 2 o'clock he came down into this very room, which had been prepared as a map room, with large tables on which a map, large-scale map of Czechoslovakia was laid out. And we know this from, well, what is it, kitchen boy who was working here, about 15 years old, Theo Hoffmann, who wanted to see his Führer, and he went outside and looked through the window, and to his surprise, he saw the Führer bent over a map with a thick pencil and cutting Czechoslovakia into pieces, all on his own. Then Hitler went outside again, and at 4 o'clock the negotiations began. Upstairs, very dramatic things happened. Mr. Chamberlain had only arrived with 3 officials of the Foreign Secretary and with no minister, whereas Hitler had arrived with Himmler, chief of police, Goebbels, chief of propaganda, Keitel, chief of the German Supreme Command, and many other big shots. And Hitler made a gesture to Chamberlain, you begin. And Chamberlain said, the French government, the British government, and including the Czechoslovakian government is prepared to give the Sudetenland to Germany. There was a pause, and then Hitler said, do I understand you rightly, Prime Minister, that these 3 governments are prepared to cede the Sudeten to Germany? And Chamberlain said yes. There was a pause again, and then Hitler said, das geht nun nicht mehr. That can't be done anymore. Well, Mr. Chamberlain spent a restless night on the Petersburg. And when he got up in the morning, he said, Rich, I'm not keeping that appointment. I'm so disappointed, I'm depressed, I will not go down for a second negotiation. And in the end, Mr. Chamberlain did decide to come down at 10:30. In this room, I have a photo here where the 2 men standing, Hitler in front of this very door. Again, there was a heated discussion, ending with Hitler saying, I will not mobilize the German army as long as your plane is over German territory.
And the last discussion ended in a friendly manner.
But Hitler wanted it his way, and he wanted it now, or there would be war. The dealer called the Godfather's terms an ultimatum which would shock world opinion. But he thought it might be acceptable.
At Cologne, the British Prime Minister was welcomed with the strains of God Save the King.
And so he comes home to the now familiar airport of Heston after his second visit to Hitler. From his own lips, let us hear that the cause of peace is not hopeless yet.
My first duty, now I have come back, is to report to the British and French governments the result of my mission. And until I have done that, it would be difficult for me to say anything about it. I will only say this. I trust that all concerned will continue their efforts to solve the Czechoslovak problem peacefully, because on that turns the peace of Europe in our time.
News that Benesch had accepted the Berchtesgaden terms after unheard of pressure had provoked demonstrations in Prague. Now that Godesberg demanded not only an arm, the Sudetenland to Germany, but also legs, in the form of concessions to the jackal states of Poland and Hungary, Beneš dared not accept. The Godesberg ultimatum would deprive Czechoslovakia of every safeguard for its national existence. In the Sudetenland, the gymnastics instructor gave orders for military exercises. His Nazi-style Freikorps, equipped with arms from Hitler, now sought by terrorism and violence to destabilize the state and allow the Godfather an opening for armed intervention. Chamberlain had received no hero's welcome in London. The cabinet, led by Halifax, had refused to accept the Godfather's ultimatum. Godesberg was rejected. It seemed that there would be war, and war in a given number of days. Daladier came to London, proving himself a bull with snail's horns, wanting to know what Britain would do. Knowing the Czechs totally refused the Godesberg demands, he had no option but to affirm that France would come to the aid of Czechoslovakia. Chamberlain agreed to support France, or so it seemed. The British government solved two problems at once by putting the unemployed to dig trenches. For 3 million people, while the British made gestures of war, across the Channel, the French mobilized in their own way by kissing their mistresses and wives farewell. The Czechs, too, prepared for war, hoping that Allied mobilization meant what it seemed.
My jsme měli armádu tehdy dobře připravenou, věřili jsme v ní, věřil v ní náš lid a dokonce jsme věřili i ve své spojence. Proto také zářijová mobilizace nebyla přijata s obavami, naopak byla přijata s nadšením. Náš lid vítal tuto mobilizaci. Věřil, že ukáže jak nepříteli, tak i spojencům, že je schopen svou zemi ubránit. Měli jsme pohraniční opevnění s takovouto dokonalou technikou, jako ku příkladu tento kanon, který byl tehdy skutečně špičkou světové vojenské techniky. Opevnění, které pokrývalo celou naši hranici, bylo schopno odolat i takovému nepříteli, jako byl německý Wehrmacht. Bylo schopno odolat i německá Luftwaffe, protože tyto protiletadlové kulomety byly rovněž tehdy na výši. A konečně ani tanková, panceřová výzbroj německé armády, kterou tehdy na tu dobu měla německá armáda dostatek. I proti té jsme byli připraveni ku příkladu těmito kanony. Všechno to byly výrobky našeho zbrojního průmyslu. Všechno bylo uděláno vlastními rukami našich lidí a bylo skutečně v té době špičkou vojenské techniky. Žel, politická rozhodnutí situaci zvrátila. Tato technika nesloužila nám k obraně, ale byla předána nepříteli. A teprve po letech, po dlouhých letech války, jsme museli my sami s našimi československými a i sovětskými vojsky bojovat proti těmto pevnostním kanónům, které už v rukou Němců bránili našemu vstupu při osvobozování Československé republiky.
The Czech frontier against Germany's pre-Anschluss borders was heavily defended with mighty fortifications. Czech morale was high, and with reason. 37 German divisions faced 30 Czech divisions, but the figures were misleading. A sizable proportion of the Czech divisions were made up of soldiers from the reserve. Still, the fortresses would have brought a measure of equality.
Tato místa právě před 50 lety navštívil britský vojenský ataše z Prahy plukovník Stronč, který v doprovodu důstojníka Československého ředitelství opevňovacích prací si prohlédl výstavbu československého opevnění. Když odjížděli, tak dole v rovinách pod kopci plukovník Stronč pravil, že věří, že německý voják se zbraní v ruce se nikdy nedostane do tohoto prostoru. Historie nedala plukovníku Strončovi za pravdu.
Doomsday was near, but it was far from being a case of die all, die merrily. And as the trenches were dug in Hyde Park, mortal men feared they would be food for power who might yet fill their own pits. But still the dealer did not give up his dream to sign a deal with Hitler.
Don't talk to me about war. Politics don't interest me. I lost my husband in the last war, and I've got my two boys to consider now.
I think we've got Hitler tight. We've caught his bluff. If we don't stop him now, we shan't get another chance. Me go to war for Czechoslovakia? Why should I? I should lose my business to begin with.
In the weeks before the Munich Agreement, all of Europe was sitting around worrying about what was going to come forth from the Nuremberg Party rally, where Hitler and Göring and a whole series of people were making speeches. They were wondering whether or not war might be declared. During that time, Göring made a speech about Czechoslovakia, a horrible speech. And interestingly enough, weeks later, when Chamberlain spoke about the importance of not going to war, it seemed as if he had absorbed part of the very kind of attitude that Göring expressed. In Göring's speech, he set the tone of the party Congress with his incredibly bellicose statement on Czechoslovakia. He said a petty segment of Europe is harassing the human race, referring to the Czechs. This miserable pygmy race without culture, no one knows where it came from, is oppressing a cultured people, and behind it is Moscow and the eternal mask of the Jew devil. When Chamberlain spoke to the British people on the night of September 26th, after it looked like the negotiations with Hitler were going to fail and war was going to come about, he used the same kind of language as Göring had used.
How horrible, fantastic, incredible it is that we should be digging trenches and trying on gas masks here because of a quarrel in a faraway country between people of whom we know nothing.
As if we knew nothing about this country of Czechoslovakia. It was a country, the only democracy in Central Europe. Clearly Chamberlain knew what it meant, what it stood for in the principles of the British Empire, as it should have for the United States.
However much we may sympathize with a small nation confronted by a big and powerful neighbor, we cannot, in all circumstances, undertake to involve the whole British Empire in war simply on her account. But if I were convinced that any nation had made up its mind to dominate the world by fear of its force, I should feel that it must be resisted. For the present, I ask you to wait as calmly as you can for the events of the next few days. As long as war has not begun, there is always hope that it may be prevented. And you know that I am going to work for peace till the last moment.
I have been hitting the German Chancellor, Herr Hitler, and I've had his piece in my hand. No, sorry, I'm getting confused.
Cut it.
Sorry,
Go on, Neville. Don't get flustered. That was lovely. Just show the script. I mean, you got the script there. We are. Just familiarise yourself with the words. And as soon as you're ready, let's go again. Action!
When I was a little boy, I used to repeat, if at first you don't succeed, try again. That's what I'm doing. When I come back, I hope I may be able to say, as Hotspur says in Henry IV, out of this metal danger, we pluck this flower safety.
There would be no war, not yet. Thanks to the Italian fixer, there would be a final conference at Munich, where the last act was played out.
Ich kann mich noch sehr gut an September 38 erinnern, weil ich da geheiratet habe. Und nachdem immer das Gerücht gegangen ist, es kommt Krieg, war das deprimierend. Und dann hat es geheißen, ja, es kommt der Chamberlain und der Daladier kommen und dann werden wir weiterschauen. Also am 30. September ist also der Tag gewesen und da ist da überall abgesperrt gewesen. Und der Chamberlain und der Daladier sind angefahren am Spätnachmittag. Und ich weiß noch, meine Freundin ist durch den Absperr durchgelaufen. Da ist das S-Mann nach und hat gesagt, da darf man nicht durch. Er hat gesagt, mein Mann ist im Krankenhaus, ich muss durch. Dann hat er gesagt, naja, sonst hätte er es gleich gepackt, aber da war alles ganz deprimiert. Und dann ist also der Chamberlain da rein ins Gebäude und hat ein paar Stunden hat's gedauert und wir haben so Angst gehabt. Und dann hat es geheißen, es kommt kein Krieg. Da waren wir selig da.
Hotel, 2 Czech delegates waited. Barred from the conference by the godfather and the dealer, they sat virtually under house arrest until the terms of the Munich agreement were brought to them. Instead of the Godesberg ultimatum, they faced the Munich agreement, but the differences were cosmetic. The godfather got what he wanted, and with the approval of the fixer, the bull with the snail's horns, and the dealer. And the Czechs? They paid the ultimate price. Their country was dismembered and left defenseless in tears and sorrow. And the conference itself was only an ultimate paradox of bitter irony. What Chamberlain refused in Godesberg, he happily signed in Munich. Here, in the Godfather's city, Munich, the scene of Hitler's unsuccessful 1923 beer hall putsch, the real purpose of the dealer's play would be seen. And it would be in the last of the Godfather's residences that a deal would be struck which would preserve peace for Britain and Germany. The war and the suffering somewhere else was not of any concern to the deal maker. Only a few miles from the beer cellars and the carousing, along a road that Chamberlain would not take as he travelled on the morrow of the conference to meet the Führer again for the last time, lay a place the name of which will ever ring with infamy. Dachau.
Also 1938 waren wir ungefähr nicht ganz 30.000 Häftlinge. Und zur selben Zeit, 1938, kann mich noch so gut erinnern, wir hatten den völkischen Beobachter und da haben wir gelesen, dass Chamberlain nach München kommt. Und das war für uns so eine Enttäuschung, dass Chamberlain mit Hitler sprechen konnte und über die Tschechoslowakei diskutieren will, den Einmarsch in die Tschechoslowakei. Wir wussten überhaupt nicht mehr, was wir sagen sollen. Wir haben gedacht, es wird vielleicht besser, aber es ist bedeutend schlechter geworden. Ich kam 1933, am 22. März 1933 zum ersten Mal nach Dachau. Und da wurde Dachau eröffnet. Ich war dort dann bis 35 wurde ich entlassen und wurde noch zum zweiten Mal 1936 wieder verhaftet und kam als Zweitmaliger, wie man hier sieht, die haben hier solche Streifen gehabt. Als Zweitmaliger kam ich dann wieder ins Lager. Und diese Leute, die man hier sieht, diese Männer, sind alle, da lebt keiner mehr. Ich war der, den man hier sieht. Und als Zweitmaliger, wenn man reingekommen ist, wurde man auf diesen Bock gestellt. Man bekommt 25 Stockhiebe und 30 Tage Arrest. Und wenn man die 30 Tage mitgemacht hat, dann kann man sich auch vorstellen, was da los war.
For those who wish to know of the fact, the existence of camps like Dachau was a foul blot on civilization. But not everyone wished to know. With the ink on the Munich agreement dry, Chamberlain travelled to the private flat of the Godfather. In his pocket were 2 copies of a declaration which he secretly prepared in London and which would ensure that Britain and Germany never again went to war. Words on paper to bind men's actions. It was a moment he had planned for, as he wrote to his sisters who were the confidants of his private thoughts. I asked Hitler about 1 in the morning, while we were waiting for the draftsman, whether he would see me for another talk. He jumped at the idea and asked me to come to his private flat in a tenement house where the other floors are occupied by ordinary citizens. Once at the lair, the two men exchanged more words, then at the end, I pulled out the declaration which I had prepared beforehand and asked if he would sign it. As the interpreter translated the words into German, Hitler frequently ejaculated, "Ja, ja," and at the end he said, "Yes, I will certainly sign it. When shall we do it?" I said, "Now," and we went at once to the writing table and put our signature to the 2 copies which I had brought with me. Hitler reflected on the unusual diplomatic protocol exchange between 2 heads of state. He, Chamberlain, seemed such a nice old gentleman. I thought I would give him my autograph as a souvenir.
And the Prime Minister comes home.
So the deed was done, and the deal was won. And with his autograph in hand, the dealer went back to his people and was a great hero to them for arranging a deal. And others had paid the price.
So our Prime Minister has come back from his 3rd and greatest journey, and he said,
I have been talking with the German Hitler, Herr Chancellor, and I have in my hand a piece of our time.
Cut it. Neville, you have in your hand a piece of paper, not a piece in our time. It's the German Chancellor, Herr Hitler, not the German Hitler, Herr Chancellor. Otherwise, it was lovely.
This morning, I had another talk with the German Chancellor, Herr Hitler. And here is the paper which bears his name upon it as well as mine. The settlement of the Czechoslovakian problem, which has now been achieved, is, in my view, only the prelude to a larger settlement in which all Europe may find peace.
O záboru naší obce a našeho kraje do Sudet proskočila mezi lidma zpráva, že od státních bývalých hranic v Harrachově směrem na Liberec bude projíždět Hitler. Byli jsme zvědaví, jak toto vypadá, a tak jsme se jeli tehdy se svým kamarádem Mirkou Otočkem podívat. Přijeli jsme po této silnici na motocyklu, ale dál už jsme se nedostali. Tady všude po obou stranách silnice klečeli v takovém snad, já nevím, šílenství davovém. Lidé, sepjaté ruky, hlavně ženy. Rukou měli rozhaté svíčky a čekali, co se bude dít. Polem okola po obou stranách silnic byly prapory Henleinovy a říšsko-německé dolů až po zem. Ve všech výkladech byly obrázky Henleina a Hitlera, u toho zase rozsvícené svíčky. A tak jsme v napětí a očekávání stáli tadyhle u té silnice. Šla nás až hrůza, musím říct, všelijaký pocit, víte, lidé v tomhletom napětí a my jsme jenom se báli promluvit česky, že by se nás ten dach snad vrhl, že by nás snad rozsehal takovým tím tou nevraživostí vůči nám Čechům.
First of all, there was the near hysterical relief felt by many in Britain when Mr. Chamberlain came back waving his famous piece of paper, imitating Disraeli and promising, as it turned out rather rashly, peace in our time. Its importance, I think, today is that, whether we like it or not, the Czechoslovaks were sailed down the river.
Po mnichovském diktátu v roce 1938 byla československá státní hranice přesunuta až na tento potůček. Ten tedy dělil československé státní území a říšsko-německé území. Zde byla velkoněmecká říše a zde bylo Československo. Někdy docházelo při takovýchhle rozdělení k absurditám anebo i takovým zvláštnostem. Zde v tom domečku bydlela rodina Jónových. Za potůčkem měli pole, dílnu a stodůlku, kam chodili za prací i pro krmení toho dobytka. Když tedy chtěli přejít do té své dílny, museli zde se prokázat propustkou strážnému, které zde stával.
As the Godfather toured his new territory, given him as the price for a deal, he was thankful that he had not had to take it by war, when the price in blood would have been heavy. For those who had paid the price for a deal, there was only pain. And the betrayed people of Prague felt agony and outrage. But then it was all very far away. Beneš, the Czech president, decided not to fight because he feared he would have to do so alone. And as the product of Western thinking, he felt that the British and French signatures at Munich expelled Czechoslovakia from the family of Western democracies in which his predecessor, Masaryk, believed so much. So he put his name on one final piece of paper and resigned.
Důsledky mnichovské kapitulace byly tragické pro československý lid i pro jeho armádu. Několik desítek kilometrů odtud v objektu Cihelna, například podůstojník zástupce velitele objektu Četař Hrad, se zastřelil jen proto, aby nemusel uposlechnout kapitulační rozkaz.
Duff Cooper, who was the only cabinet minister to resign over Munich, said in his resignation speech, "The Prime Minister may be right. I can assure you, Mr. Speaker, with the deepest sincerity, that I hope and pray that he is right. But I cannot believe what he believes. I wish I could. Therefore, I can be of no assistance to him. I should be only a hindrance, and it is much better that I should go. I remember when we were discussing the Godesberg ultimatum that I said that if I were a party to persuading, or even to suggesting to the Czechoslovak government that they should accept that ultimatum, I should never be able to hold up my head again. I have forfeited a great deal. I have given up an office that I loved, work in which I was deeply interested, and a staff of which any man might be proud. I have given up association in that work with my colleagues, with whom I've maintained for many years the most harmonious relations, not only as colleagues, but as friends. I have given up the privilege of serving as a lieutenant to a leader whom I still regard with the deepest admiration and affection. I have ruined, perhaps, my political career. but that is little matter. I have retained something which is to me of greater value. I can still walk about the world with my head erect. And if Duff Cooper's name and the name of the anti-appeasers will live in history, I think it is as a protest in the name of honour against an agreement which seemed to them, however expedient it was at the time, deeply dishonourable.
Barely 3 weeks after Munich, and in the midst of a rising national debate about the results that had occurred in Munich, Kennedy gave his most controversial speech to date at a Trafalgar Day dinner of the Navy League in Great Britain. He said in this speech, "It has long been a theory of mine that it is unproductive for both democracies and dictatorships to widen their divisions. Indeed," he said, "though democratic and dictator countries differ ideologically, to be sure, that should not preclude the possibility of good relations between them. After all," he concluded, "we have to live together in the same world, whether we like it or not." Now, in another time, in another day, that philosophy of coexistence might have been very productive. But in that atmosphere at that time, when you had this madman Hitler and all the terrible things he was doing to the world on the one side, to have the ambassador to the court of St. James from the United States calling for coexistence with his dictatorship was a terrible thing. And it caused a huge uproar, even in the United States.
God bless you all.
There were worldwide protests, the bitterest coming from veteran Czech soldiers in America who had been decorated by the victor powers of 1918. They gave back the medals tarnished by Munich.
All Czechoslovak soldiers on the other side and the United States returning those medals to the Allies because their country and liberty was betrayed.
After the betrayal by Chamberlain and Daladier in Munich, it's not honorable for any man to wear their tin.
I have repeated lately that my little country has paid almost the supreme price in trying to preserve European democracy. And I say to you that if it is for peace that my country has been butchered up in this unprecedented manner, I am glad of it. If it isn't, may God have mercy on our soul.
Jednalo se o celý stát, který vlastně byl vynechán z jednání a který směl stát jen za dveřma, zatímco se za jednacím stolem mezi 4 mocnostmi projednávaly otázky jeho životní existence. Tohle jsou snímky, které jsem viděl už mnohokrát a nikdy mě ještě nenechávají zapomenout na to, co se stalo. Já jsem tehdy natáčel někde na Jižní Moravě a tam byli lidé, většinou Židé, kteří nemohli k nám, protože neměli zdejší příslušnost a nemohli zpátky, protože tam je čekal osud nejhorší. Tak se pohybovali jako štvaná zvířata v kleci a tam zůstávali odsouzení k tomu, že jim místní lidé aspoň vypomáhali slámou a nějakým přísudem nějakých potravin. A tak ta situace vypadala po celé 2-3 dny, které tam byli nuceni strávit. Do dneška je to určitý kašmár, nightmare, kterou prožívám každou špatnou svou noc, že se mi tyto scény vracejí ještě a nevím, co bych vám ještě k tomu řekl. Je to špatná doba. Špatná doba.
It is such a blow to democracy in Europe that I do not believe it can survive. In München, they negotiated about us without us. Czechoslovak nation is forced to Calvary to be crucified. We did not deserve this fate.
The diplomatic shuffle over, godfathers stood side by side with hunters as sponsors to the new generation which was to inherit their world.
Been asked by the newspaper men this afternoon what I thought the chances were of appeasement succeeding. I told them I wasn't sure at all, but it was certainly worthwhile trying. After all, there are two terrible dilemmas in Europe: economic chaos and war. And anything that can keep us out of either of those should be tried. After all, it's much better for the United States if there's no war in Europe. And therefore all efforts should be devoted to that end.
But the young Chamberlains were not to inherit the peaceful future which their grandfather had tried so hard to gain. The empire would not be preserved. The new year was seen in London with celebrations, and the Bohemians of Britain at the Chelsea Arts Ball had little thought for other Bohemians. But the bubbles they made and chased were as insubstantial as the words which had once guaranteed Tomasz Masaryk's creation, and as fragile as the deal made at Munich. The end of winter brought the tale of the end of the shadow of Czech independence, as Hitler showed what his word was worth by occupying Prague. What now of racial purity and the promise of peace? At last, he could stand at the window of Hradčany Castle and fancy himself controller of the key to the mastery of Europe. And war was only 5 months away.
The life of all nations depends in the last resort upon mutual respect for one another's rights and reasonable confidence that they can each live their life in their own way, provided that they do not interfere with their neighbor's right to do the same. Throughout their history, the British people have always felt bound to oppose attempts by one power to dominate Europe at the expense of others.
British statesmen had rediscovered their honor again, as the Foreign Secretary told the country when Poland was threatened. But what a shame that by this time the Ribbentrop-Molotov Pact made the effort a costly one. Stalin had shown how quickly he had learned from Chamberlain how to appease Hitler.
Having sent the Czechoslovaks down the river in the end of 1938, having betrayed the only democracy in Eastern Europe in early 1939, quite inexplicably, pushed perhaps by public opinion, Mr. Chamberlain guaranteed Poland, which was a totalitarian state, which had no decent army, and which the British could not reach. This, no doubt, Chamberlain's admirers would claim, was a great triumph of British statesmanship. I find, in retrospect, rather difficult to see it anything other than a panic move, which, of course, led Britain into a war which she was not prepared for, and by May and June 1940, Britain was on the verge of a major military defeat. This, I think, was where the road from Munich led. the fact that, thanks to, first of all, the Russian army and then the Americans, that Britain survived and came out on the right side, winning side in 1945, owed nothing to Mr. Chamberlain's foresight and everything to a great accumulation of luck and to Mr. Churchill's willpower in May 1940.
Churchill had, after all, been right when he said that Munich, instead of peace with honor, was war with dishonor. Unable to fight and die for their country in 1938, many Czech pilots fled to die in 1940 for a faraway country of which they knew nothing, Great Britain. The British have repaid them by forgetting. That was part of the Czech tragedy, as was the road to war. Chamberlain's excuse after Munich that Britain needed time to rearm and that 1 year of delay was a gain was only a hollow myth. Hitler gained everything. And here, obscurely in Westminster Abbey, is the memorial to the man who died in 1940, broken and bitterly disappointed. Because of his deal, Germany now possessed the Czech arms works, industry, and a pact with Russia. The extra time had not helped. Words had failed.
I have been talking with the German Chancellor, Herr Hitler, and I have in my hand a piece of shit.
Cut it. Level! Level! Level!